I'm Kevin Freeman, and you're in the Economic War Room. This is a very special edition of the Economic War Room because we are with the Falkirk Center at the Freedom Summit at the Trump International Hotel. We have tremendous guests throughout the summit. We just saw Steve Bannon, and he had a really terrific lineup, starting with Peter Navarro. And we've got great guests coming for the next couple of days here at the Freedom Summit. But in the Economic War Room, I want to talk about China, and I want to talk with two guests. First, Gordon Chang, who is one of the greatest experts on China anywhere in the world. And second, with my good friend Rod Martin, who is a futurist who understands the direction where things are heading. But first, let me introduce Gordon Chang. He's the author of The Great U.S.-China Tech War and Losing South Korea. His previous books are Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World, and The Coming Collapse of China, which is an important one. Gordon lived and worked in China and Hong Kong for almost 2 decades, most recently in Shanghai as counsel to the American law firm Paul Weiss, and earlier in Hong Kong as a partner in an international law firm, Baker & McKenzie. He's been writing on China for a long time, and has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, American Conservative, International Herald Tribune, Daily Beast, National Review, Barron's. He has also appeared frequently as a guest on CNN, Fox News, Fox Business, CNBC, MSNBC, PBS, BBC, Bloomberg Television, and he's a guest in the Economic War Room frequently. He served 2 terms as a trustee for Cornell University, and his Twitter handle is Gordon G. Chang. So welcome, Gordon.
Thank you so much, Kevin.
You know, there's so much we can talk about, but let's start with the fact that when we walked into the room, we were both wearing masks. Something happened starting in maybe December, maybe earlier, out of China that has impacted the American economy like nothing else. I think it's the greatest economic weapon unleashed in the history of the world. Tell us about what's happened.
And you certainly would be right. We've got to, a lot of people say, we should cooperate with China on finding a vaccine and what to do about this disease. And that sounds good to the ear, but the problem is that China deliberately took steps that led to the release of this disease around the world. So, for instance, you go back to Wuhan. Doctors in Wuhan, no later than the 2nd week of December, knew that this disease was human-to-human transmissible. Now, China didn't say anything publicly until January 20. Now, if Beijing had said nothing about human-to-human transmissibility in that 5 weeks, that would have been grossly irresponsible. But worse, what they tried to do was to convince the world that it was not H-to-H, human-to-human. At the same time, Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, he pressured countries not to impose travel restrictions and quarantines on arrivals from China. You put those 2 things together, and you come to the conclusion that this was going to lead to the disease, which should have been just contained to the central part of China around Wuhan, to make it go to the 4 corners of the globe. So that shows you that Xi Jinping, whatever was going in his mind, I think that he looked around China, saw how it crippled his country, and decided he was going to get even. Because if that's in fact what he did, he would have done the same thing that he in fact did do. So we've got to be concerned that this was a malicious assault on our country and countries around the world.
Now, you mentioned that he argued and lobbied to not restrict people from leaving China so that they'd go around the world. But weren't there travel restrictions going into Beijing?
Yeah, in China itself, from January 23, the Wuhan and surrounding cities were locked down. That eventually came to be about 75 million people. At the same time, after January 23, we know that Xi Jinping spent a lot of effort on lobbying other countries. So, for instance, when President Trump declared the travel quarantines and restrictions on just January 31, he took enormous heat from Beijing, as well as from domestic critics who called him xenophobic. That line, by the way, comes from someone who's known as Vice President Biden. But the point is, China had to know what it was doing. So this is the first time in history, Kevin, that one country has attacked all the others in the world. And we have seen now, 143,000 Americans have died so far, and there's trillions and trillions of dollars of economic damage.
Well, they not only encouraged travel, and although they restricted it domestically inside China, but they also scooped up all of the personal protection equipment. I was on the phone actually with Steve Bannon and with one of the largest suppliers of PPE in the United States. We got on, and Rosemary Gibson, who's written China RX, and we were talking about how American suppliers of PPE found that their container ships were confiscated by the Chinese and then sold off into China or provided into China. So they knew something was going on. This was back in January, I believe, maybe early February. They knew something was going on, and they were making the situation worse for the rest of the world and better for themselves.
Yeah. Maria Bartiromo, the Fox business anchor, talked about this on air, how she said that they turned around ships which had PPE that were bound for New York hospitals. Peter Navarro, who I take it was on with Steve just a little while ago, he mentioned that one American factory making these N95 masks that was actually nationalized by Beijing. There have been so many stories as you talk to people around this country about how their hospitals had all this equipment stopped in shipment. So yes, this was, China says, oh, we need to cooperate. Well, no, they were extremely selfish.
Yeah, no question about it. And it's also not just selfish, it's the way that you maximize the economic impact. So it created this cognitive dissonance where the American people say, hey, wait, all the health officials said don't wear a mask. Well, they didn't say don't wear a mask because they thought it would be bad or spread the virus worse or whatever. They said don't wear a mask because there were shortages here in this country, and they were trying to protect the hospital system.
That's right.
So then they turn around and say, oh, everybody has to wear a mask. And so the American people say, well, wait, it creates distrust in the American government, but it was purposed and planned by the Chinese Communist Party to impact our nation.
And it certainly has, because we have seen the change. Think about what the U.S. was like in January, and think about what it's like here now. We're basically talking to an empty room because those are the rules in Washington, D.C. You've got to do that. So it has changed everything about our lives. And we've got to remember that China's not done with this, and nor is this virus. So this is an attack on the United States. It was deliberate. It's resulted in the deaths of Americans. And we got to remember, Kevin, this is not the last pathogen that is going to be generated from Chinese soil. Since that time, we've seen the G4 virus, all the rest of it. And if we don't deter China, then they will do this again, because it will happen. Years, maybe decades, but they will do this again unless we deter them.
Well, they learned it's effective. You can undermine an economy, you can undermine a foreign administration, you can impact the rest of the world, and if you plan for it, if you purposed for it, can you imagine how much more effective they could have been if it had been purposed and planned?
Well, just yesterday, NBC News and other outlets reported how Americans in 3 separate states received packets of seeds. Now, they were marked as jewelry when they came in. This was unsolicited shipments. This came from China. And the question is this another form of biological warfare? We have got to be concerned about what China's doing, because especially this year, there has been across the board malicious Chinese attacks on us, whether disinformation campaigns, whether the sending into our country of all sorts of items, or the coronavirus. This is an attack on the United States.
Well, we've gotten frozen pork that apparently contained pig Ebola and other things. You've got to start wondering when you open these containers and you find this much bad stuff. Is it purposed? Is it planned? Is this economic warfare? I tend to think that it is.
Well, just one other example. At the end of January, Customs and Border Patrol seized 900,000 $1 bills. They were counterfeit. They came from China. Nobody counterfeits $1 bills, Rob. It's just not done for profit. And by the way, nobody in China's near total surveillance state, nobody can counterfeit U.S. currency without the Communist Party knowing about it.
Right.
So what's going on here? I tend to think that China was trying to fuel protest groups in our country. We saw in May in Louisville, Customs and Border Patrol seized 10,800 parts for assault weapons. These came from Shenzhen in China. We've got to be concerned about China's links to these protest groups. And also, just one other point. Everyone says, the State Department says, Justice Department says, look, we closed China's Houston consulate because of spying. And yes, we did. And they were also involved in other dangerous activities. But there's also a hint, unconfirmed, but there's a hint that the Houston consulate was involved in links with protest groups, providing financial and logistical support. We need to investigate these because we see so many other facts, and that leads us to the question, what is China doing?
Indeed.
Before we get to the consulates, let's talk just for a second about the weapons that were seized, the weapons parts, right? And they put a dollar amount on them. It wasn't a large total dollar amount. It was $100,000 something dollars worth, but it was enough for a lot of weapons. From my understanding, those were parts that turned conventional semi-automatic rifles into automatic rifles. So they're far more dangerous than the value would suggest. If you put those into some of the militia groups that are carrying weapons around, you've created essentially semi-automatic rifles. And those are illegal parts, and they were seized, and they've been shipped into the country. You got to wonder, what are they up to?
Yeah, well, you know, if these were to come from Great Britain or something, you'd say, well, was it the government or was it just sort of criminals? But we know that in a near total surveillance state, China's extremely sophisticated. You can't build these parts. You can't send them to the United States without the Communist Party knowing about it. So we have to assume that this was not just some sort of criminal in Shenzhen. This was a criminal in Shenzhen who had the backing of somebody in Beijing. China wanted this to occur. And we have, as I mentioned, the counterfeit bills, which are inexplicable.
Yeah, dollar bills.
I mean, it's just $1 bills. I mean, people don't even counterfeit $5 bills anymore.
Now, North Korea does a good job with $100 bills, but why in the world would you do a $1 bill?
Oh, and by the way, when North Korea counterfeits those super notes, their operations are usually in China. So yes, it's North Korea is the bad actor, but China knows about this. North Korean hacking. So for instance, Sony Pictures Entertainment.
Yeah, right.
Those started from IP addresses in Shenyang, inside Chinese soil, as borders. So yes, North Korea hacked Sony, as we say, but we've got to remember that this was China. Because when you have the Great Firewall, which is the most sophisticated set of internet controls in the world, you have to know about the attacks going out. You have to know about the hundreds of terabytes of data that is coming back into China. So clearly this was an attack on Sony by China.
Yeah, no, China's a bad actor. And Rod, I'll bring you into this for just a second. You have a son who is at the Mayo Clinic, and
yes.
He and I were going back and forth. The impact that China has caused on our health system by unleashing this virus. Your son has talked about literally not having the personal protection equipment, but then how the hospital essentially shut down, so the economic impact just on our health system.
Oh, it's extraordinary. And, you know, not just Mayo or hospitals local to us in Florida, but in the first 3 weeks in New York City, there was an 800% spike in the number of people who died at home of a heart attack because they couldn't get seen. I mean, 800%? And of course, Mayor de Blasio issued a do not resuscitate order. So if somebody codes in the ambulance, you can't resuscitate them even though they're on their way to the ER. As you know, we had a few partisan issues there. Certain Democrat governors were very intent on seeding our nursing homes with COVID patients and prohibiting them by law from finding out if those patients had COVID, had been tested, had any diagnosis of any sort. And the result of that so far has been 3 times as many deaths just in New York nursing homes as in the entire state of Florida. So yes, elections do matter. That's rather extraordinary. But yes, the immediate impact on the healthcare system has not been so much what we were concerned about in March, you know, flatten the curve. 2 weeks to flatten the curve, 4 weeks to flatten the curve, yeah, whatever. That's obviously not the goal. But the goal is very plainly, as you see from at least a Chinese perspective, certainly I think from a socialist perspective in general, the bankrupting of the private healthcare system. Mayo, for example, took its first across-the-board pay cut in 165 years. The losses just at Rochester are extraordinary, and you see that across healthcare systems throughout the United States. Rural healthcare is reeling. Lots of hospitals are going bankrupt. Lots of private practice groups are going bankrupt because, honestly, everything's about COVID all the time. And I think that's a policy mistake in this country, but the net effect of this is likely to be, if we continue in this vein, a situation in which we have to have socialized medicine because there's no alternative. And I think that serves the political interests of some in this country at least as much as it does those in Beijing.
So you stop and you think about this. The impact here is now to individual citizens like never before. When the Office of Personnel Management was hacked by China, it impacted those that were involved in the government, and we understood that. But here, the average person, you may have lost your job, you may have lost your health care, you may be unwilling to go in to see the doctor, you may have lost your life. But the impact is here, and yet we have a political system where for the first time in my lifetime, the president has called out China as a threat. Yes. And yet, we have on the other side Vice President Biden, who's famous for saying, come on, man, they're no competition for us. What are the political implications, Gordon?
Well, clearly right now, a number of things are going on. China has become political because we have the November 3 election. But what we have seen with the vice president is essentially those comments from May of last year where he said, oh, look, China's not competition for us, and the Chinese leaders are not bad folks. And that's his general posture. So we've got to be concerned that he's not taking a robust view of China's challenge to us, which I believe is existential. Going back to what Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, his view of the world is not some sort of Westphalian system where countries compete with each other and cooperate. What he believes is in worldwide Chinese rule, the imperial notion of Tianxia, or Chinese ruler is the only legitimate ruler of all under heaven. So that's the context that we need to look at in terms of China's actions. People say, oh, this is just one of those boys will be boys contests between China and the U.S. No, it's not. We are trying to defend an international system that has been in place since the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648. China wants to go back to the imperial times. It's just an existential challenge.
And so where you see Vice President Biden signaling, this is who I might have as an advisor, this is who might formulate my China policy, what do you see if there is a President Biden, what would that administration look like?
There's two things, and put aside for the moment the differing views in China between President Trump and Vice President Biden. We know a couple things will happen in any administration. In the first year of any new administration, there's a generally 12, maybe 18-month honeymoon because all new presidents, including President Trump, want to see if they can develop a cooperative relationship with China. And so we're going to lose time. We're going to lose at least a year, maybe 18 months, maybe 4 years, at a time where it is just every moment is critical because we've got to defend ourselves because of the coronavirus and because of other things that Beijing has been doing. The other thing that's of concern, and you mentioned this, Kevin, is that the Democratic foreign policy establishment is very wedded to the old engagement view of we got to cooperate with China. That's a view that sounds good to the ear, but just hasn't worked for half century. And what the important thing is, we have heard from Vice President Pence, Attorney General Barr, National Security Advisor O'Brien, and most notably, Secretary of State Pompeo, there is a new whole-of-government approach on China. Pompeo's speech last Thursday was striking, where he said, look, we're not going to engage China for the sake of engaging them. We're only going to engage them to get fairness and reciprocity. But more important, we are going to, and he said, engage and empower the Chinese people with in-person diplomacy. In other words, what the Secretary of State was saying, though he didn't use this term, but he was really talking about regime change. And that's necessary because the regime in China is unreformable. It's not capable of change. And clearly we have seen that we've got to reduce our vulnerability to it. We have no long-term enduring solution except to change the regime in China. And this administration, and specifically Secretary Pompeo, has said this in public.
Well, the other term that comes to mind is Reagan doctrine. Actually deal with the enemy on their own soil instead of on ours. And, I would certainly hope, and I think everyone here would, that there wouldn't be actual warfare. But on the other hand, what we're experiencing right now is more deadly than 2 Vietnam Wars from the United States perspective. So at what point do you draw a line and say that we are not already engaged in a form of warfare? It is perhaps not quite a Cold War yet. It is certainly not a hot war, except, wait, we're losing 140,000 people. This is non-trivial. So yes, I thought Secretary Pompeo's remarks were extraordinary. I thought he was spot on. It was so refreshing to hear it out of a U.S. official's mouth, and not least for just this simple reason. It made sense to prop up China, especially coming out of the Cultural Revolution and all of the catastrophe of the preceding 2 decades, in a Cold War context where we have to encircle the Soviet Union and bring it down. Cold War's been over a little while.
Yep.
I'm not sure too many people in Washington have quite figured that out on certain levels. The idea that Russia, with an economy roughly the size of Texas, is a massive geopolitical threat is a little odd, especially when you're facing an actual geopolitical threat in Beijing that is rising quickly, largely on the backs of our propping them up, our handing them technology, hand over fist, our having done everything we can to facilitate their rise for now, as you said, half a century, but particularly an odd quarter century in which there's no geopolitical benefit to the United States to do so. And the fact that we're starting to realize that, wait, these people don't have our best interests at heart. I mean, the mere fact that Chinese people are individually wonderful folks does not change the fact that they have an evil regime. German people are wonderful individually too, but that doesn't make Hitler good. So, or Russian people are great, but that doesn't make Brezhnev good. So why have we been so Pollyanna about this? And of course, one of the answers can't help but be, because you keep mentioning Joe Biden, Hunter Biden got 10 figures from the Chinese Communist Party while he was on an official trip with his dad as vice president. Are we going to ignore these obvious corruption issues forever? The Chinese have done a phenomenal job of infiltrating and buying off American officials for decades. Peter Schweitzer has done a phenomenal job of documenting this.
Yep.
We need to wake up.
Yep, there's no question about that. And when you stop and you look at the idea, the obvious play for the Trump administration, had there not been the Russia scandal, would have been to go to Putin and say, look, the Chinese will eat you and they will destroy Russia at some point. Why are you siding with China here? Because obviously, President Putin, you've got a threat on your southern border that is enormous. But President Trump can't do that. And the Democratic Party is not going to do it because they have, not all, but literally some officials have been bought off. And they've controlled the media. So when we see consulate closings, and I want to get to that, when we see consulate closings, we see this huge backlash. Why could you? This is wrong. You shouldn't close consulates. But that potentially in Houston was a bad situation. Tell us about that, Gordon.
Yeah. In Houston, the consulate was involved in espionage. We learned some of the details on Friday when the State Department, the Justice Department, and the U.S. intelligence community had that joint briefing. The couple things that are going on there. First of all, of course, there was the espionage. There are a lot of energy companies in Houston. Those energy companies are in the South China Sea, which China claims as its own, but which everybody else says is international global commons. So there was the spying element. And it was, consulates, and it's not just China, countries use their consulates for spying, but in China's consulate in Houston, it was especially intense. It had gone beyond the bounds of what is generally considered acceptable in terms of consular activity. Also, they were using the consulate for Operation Fox Hunt. This is Xi Jinping's attempt to bring back Chinese officials who have fled. And so Ministry of State security agents were operating out of the Houston consulate from, as what we can tell, in terms of Operation Fox Hunt. And they were also monitoring strictly Chinese students in the U.S. And many of those students were being mobilized for political purposes. So you have all of that, and then, as I mentioned, there are these unconfirmed rumors that the consulate had these links with protest groups in the U.S. So the U.S. had to send a message. You know, Secretary Pompeo met his Chinese counterpart in Honolulu last month, and I understand that there were certain warnings delivered. The Chinese just completely ignored them, and so we had to do something. So this is not like the U.S. wanted to do this. It had no choice but to do this. And we know that the other 4 consulates are also engaged in nefarious activities.
Dan, well, you mentioned Chinese students. How many Chinese students, now, not now because we closed schools down and everything, last year, how many Chinese students were there in the United States?
Depending on your estimate, 360 to 392,000. Probably at the higher end is the correct number.
Is it true, if you're a Chinese student coming here, that you could be called on at any point to serve the Chinese Communist Party? Is that true?
Definitely, and there's 2 reasons for that. And this is true for every Chinese national. China's 2017 national intelligence law requires every Chinese national, every Chinese company to spy if demanded. So you're under a compulsion to spy. Also, more important, the Communist Party's top-down system. Nobody can ignore a demand from the party. I mean, the party, of course, is supposed to be implementing history. So you know, you just cannot ignore their demands. So for those 2 reasons, every Chinese national, including the students, are under compulsion to spy. And we have yet to start to wrap our minds around it. Because after all, this is our country. We can stop this, or we can substantially reduce it by taking some common sense measures, and previous administrations hadn't done that.
Yeah, so the problem is American universities have become dependent on Chinese students, and so American universities have been co-opted in that sense, plus the Confucius Institutes. So they have infiltrated the halls of power, which would include the media, academic institutions, government, the American corporations. You walk through the list, and China has done a very good job of convincing nearly everyone in power in this country that we have to follow the Chinese line. And I even saw it on CNBC this morning where they said, well, of course, it's inevitable that China will have the world's largest economy.
No, it isn't.
Yeah, it's not inevitable.
Yeah, well, maybe, I hope it is inevitable with a different regime. I hope the standard of living of the Chinese people rises. I hope they have a different regime and they offer liberty to their, so I hope it is inevitable, but not with the Communist Party in charge.
No. China, for the first quarter, said the economy contracted 6.8%, probably double that. Second quarter, they claimed 3.2% growth. I think it was probably still in a contraction phase from underlying indicators and from surveys that have been done. China's got some real problems, though. It's not just the coronavirus. They've got too much debt, which they have just accumulated, which it really limits their long-term potential. And they've got other structural problems, one of them being that Xi Jinping is trying to move the country back to a Maoist, state-dominated economy. And we know that that has never worked in Chinese history.
Indeed not.
Yep. Yeah, and the last one is potentially they've got environmental disasters, whether it's the engineering failure at the Three Gorges Dam or any of a host of other environmental problems. And what we see, unfortunately, is we see American corporations giving them a pass on environmental, social, governance, ESG, that they're holding American companies to those standards and they're allowing the Chinese to violate those standards. That's another serious problem.
Yeah.
You think it's reformable?
I don't think the system can be reformed, and it's largely because of the nature of a communist system. You know, people have talked, Jean Kirkpatrick and others have talked about the difference between authoritarian governments and totalitarian ones, and she was absolutely right about that. Totalitarian governments are organized very differently. They believe not just in themselves being the right to rule, but they believe in this whole notion of history, that history demands that the Communist Party rule the entire world. And when you see this top-down system, especially becoming even worse under Xi Jinping, it is just, I think, a point where it can't be reformed. We know how dangerous it has been to the United States and others. And so our policy should very well be regime change. It's a concept that is out of favor in the United States. We don't want to think about the consequences of what China's doing, but nonetheless to protect ourselves, because this is an existential challenge. We may lose our republic. We have got to understand the fundamental nature of what Beijing is doing to attack us relentlessly each and every day.
Well, that's what we're facing on the most immediate term, and Gordon is entirely right. It's existential, and the election may determine the course of America regarding China, and the course of America regarding China may well determine the future of liberty on the planet. I mean, this is a serious fight. But I want to turn now to a second topic, and we've had Rod in the discussion, but I want to formally introduce you to Rod Martin, who is the founder and CEO of the Martin Organization.
Yeah.
He's a technology entrepreneur, futurist, hedge fund manager, and thought leader from Destin, Florida. Fox Business calls him tech guru. Gawker once called him a brilliant nonconformist, and Britain's Guardian describes him as philosopher capitalist. He was part of the original PayPal startup team and served as a special counsel to Peter Thiel, who was CEO there, and policy director to Governor Mike Huckabee in Arkansas. He's on a host of committees. I've known him for a long time. He's also a part of the Committee on the Present Danger, China. And so, Rod, let's talk about China from a longer-term view. Let's talk about the race to space and what they intend versus what our space program is looking like and what we need to do to counter them.
Well, I almost never disagree with you, as you know. However, I do disagree that I want China to ever be the dominant economic power, because they can be absolutely wealthy as all get out and us still win.
Okay, I'll give you that.
And that's exactly where we're going with the conversation. Of course, I would like to reach back to something you said about the Westphalian system. Nationalism as a term has taken on some unfortunate connotations, and with some good reason, not least communist propaganda against it, because the communists wish to abolish nation states. But it's important for us to understand why. When we're talking about Chinese imperialism, we need to talk about just communist imperialism in general, socialist imperialism in general. What we're talking about fundamentally is the scam Karl Marx conducted on the world, which was not to liberate anyone. You know, he's writing in the context of the revolutions of 1848, when you have liberal revolutions in the sense of classical liberalism across Europe, and they were seeking to free themselves from an aristocracy, from a set of monarchies, and Marx's brilliant scam was to disguise what looks like another step in the direction of liberalism, but is actually a substitution of one set of monarchs for a new one. Okay. And we will call the dukes and earls commissars, but we still have an aristocratic system with a monarch at the top, and that is what socialism is. So that suits China perfectly, because they've been an empire longer than anybody, and that is what we're facing. If we have a proper nationalism, you know, what I think most Americans would be more comfortable calling patriotism, in which we're simply saying that individual discrete groups of people have the right to make their own rules and not be tread upon by others. Well, that's how Kenya becomes independent. That's how India is not ruled by the British. That's how Poland isn't part of Germany and Russia. That's how America is free. That's a proper system of nation states, and that does come from Westphalia, but wasn't fully developed until the 20th century. So as we look forward, I think that's a proper way by which we would wish to organize not just the world as we know it, but the worlds that we're about to occupy. And that's the technological issue that you're talking about. Technology determines reach in a fundamental way. It took months, once upon a time, to sail around the world. Now I get on a plane and I'm across the world in a few hours. hopefully in first class, because man, coach is the worst. But truly, it's not a big deal. And anybody can go anywhere now. Okay, well, that's the development of the airplane. So 100 years ago, there's no meaningful airline anywhere. There had been a Zeppelin airline in Germany, but the war kind of put paid to that. And Dalag is trying to get off the ground again after the war. But airplanes, those are kind of toys. I mean, when you started using those in World War I, pilots were up there shooting revolvers at each other. I mean, this is crazy. And in the 20s, very, very much as you now see with the COTS program at NASA, you saw government actually do a positive thing, which is very, very difficult for government to ever do, but in this case they did. They actually let contracts to anybody who could carry the mail. If you want to carry airmail, you can carry it, just show that you're able and we'll give you a contract. And that produced a massive growth in the aeronautics industry and, of course, the very next thing, passenger airlines. And so you go from biplanes at the end of, 100 years ago. So 1920, you go from biplanes that are kind of barnstorming and doing county fairs to the destruction of Battleship Row in Pearl Harbor 21 years later.
Wow, yeah.
And 6 years after that, we break the sound barrier. And 10 years after that, you have Sputnik. And 12 years after that, you have Apollo 11. Neil Armstrong walks on the moon, and 747s are flying around.
Well,
once it gets going, it's fast.
Yeah, well, let's start. Before you even get going, though, government wasn't able to produce an airplane.
No.
General Quast talks about this. They gave the best scientists, best engineers on the planet, the U.S. government gave them free rein, whatever you need, let's build an airplane, and they weren't able to do it. But bicycle guys, the Wright brothers, were able to pull it off. In fact, the New York Times, I think, wrote in the early 20th century that it'd be 100 million years before man was ever able to develop an airplane. I don't think that's the exact amount, but it's never in our lifetime and any lifetime after that. That was printed in the New York Times, and just shortly after that, the Wright brothers understood that you could make an airplane. So it can't be, which leads me to this point, though. All of that future that we have can be developed by private enterprise, probably not developed by government. So China, which is top down, has to do what? They have to steal the intellectual property, right?
They will steal certain things that I'm about to mention, but I don't know that it will do them that much good, in the near term at least, because you're fundamentally right, and we have never seen a better example of how right you are than the development of space transportation in the United States, which has been largely dominated by a handful of rocket systems that were designed in the 50s and 60s. And to this day, if there were no Elon Musk, you would need to be launching payloads on, for instance, an Atlas V, and you'd spend about $150 million to launch that payload, but you wouldn't have transparent pricing. You wouldn't actually know what you were paying until the end of the process when it's time to do the wire transfer, because they didn't have to. United Launch Alliance doesn't have to be transparent until Elon Musk forces them to be. And by the way, this may be the only good program Barack Obama ever initiated, but the COTS program allowed the kind of competition in companies like SpaceX that will unleash a new era, and indeed already has begun to. What Elon has done with reusability was laughed at Boeing, was laughed at Lockheed Martin. Russia and China have done nothing to compete with it. They are now hopelessly obsolete on all of their launch systems, all. SLS is a joke. If it ever flies, I'll be surprised. It is simply obsolete, because when Elon can fly that same $150 million payload on a Falcon 9 for $62 million and still make a ton of money on it, who the heck wants an Atlas? Who wants that? By the way, you're talking about a system that was originally designed in the 60s. So Elon builds an entirely new system, spends a lousy $1 billion. I mean, understand, NASA gets $20 billion a year. Elon had 180 million coming out of PayPal, and he put 60 of it into Tesla. So he's got 120 one time, and he puts it into things that blow up in midair. And he comes up with this and eventually makes some money with it and spends $1 billion on reusability. And now you watch it on TV all the time. You'll watch the two boosters from the side of a Falcon Heavy land simultaneously, flawlessly. They're good to reuse in a matter of days. That's hard to compete with. And to give you an idea of the cost differential of where that gets, because it's not there yet because he doesn't have enough of a fleet of these and they haven't flown often enough. But what you're going to see is you're going to see the cost of that $150 million launch drop to about $700,000. Basically, you're paying for fuel because the rockets are there. The rockets have been flying for a while. It's like getting on a 737. I get on a 737 from Atlanta, I fly to Dallas, no big deal. I spend a few $100s on the ticket. The cost differential is almost identical between that Atlas V and where you'll be in 5 years or 6 with a Falcon 9 as flying to Dallas on a 737 on a passenger ticket and building a brand new 737 to fly one time to Dallas. That's what SpaceX has done. That is why everybody's now obsolete. Will they steal the technology? Absolutely. But they're 10 years behind on implementation, and by then, what Elon is about to roll out is going to make that look like nothing.
Well, let's talk, Gordon. What do you know about the China's space program? Are you aware of satellites and all of that?
The one thing that you need to know about China's space program, the most important thing, is that there's no civilian program.
Right.
This is military. And even when you talk about research, so for instance, when they start to look at the dark side of the moon, they have military applications in mind. What they want to do is dominate the high ground. And that's where they're going with all of this. When we think about China, the most important thing is that they're building the infrastructure to dominate the world, and they're starting in space. So for us, that's where we need to look at this. In China, they have this concept of civil-military fusion. We have civilian programs, we have military, and of course there is cross-fertilization. But in China, everything that is in a civilian program is directly pipelined into the People's Liberation Army if the PLA wants it. So, for instance, when Google cooperates with Peking University or Tsinghua University on artificial intelligence, all of that goes into the military. It's the same thing for space.
Yeah, no, we have our corporations here that fight to keep the government from seeing what they're doing, and they build, Apple, for example, they build security systems so the government can't immediately go in. In China, it is required, it's mandated. And so whether they're taking the information off your smartphone device from TikTok and
which they are
stealing that, or whatever else that they do. And so this is the threat, the hacking threat. If we're developing and our entrepreneurs are building this space capability and technology, the hacking threat, and we see the hacking threat, across the board, whether it is in coronavirus research, and Gordon, you've written about that and talked about that. They're trying to steal the answer because whoever solves the coronavirus problem is instantly wealthy, instantly successful, instantly.
This is our version of the race to the moon, the vaccine for coronavirus, and China's doing its best to steal it. I agree with you in terms of the commercial applicability of a lot of their theft. You're right. They've got it, but they don't know what to do with it. The coronavirus is different, though.
Yes, it is.
That's because there is an immediate application for this. And just to show you the broad nature of China's program, last week, the UK said Russia was trying to steal coronavirus research. Well, Russia's not trying to develop a vaccine for coronavirus. What they're doing in Russia is they're stealing it for China. So China steals for itself, and it gets its cutouts to do the same thing. But this has been something that American officials have been warning now for 3 or 4 months. And we've got to understand that Beijing is absolutely determined to do this because they believe that they can take advantage of the coronavirus for geopolitical purposes. And if they've got the vaccine, they will be seen as the quote-unquote superior society.
Yes. But in that same vein, the superior society in a relatively short amount of time is going to be the one that dominates space for the reasons you were just describing. They are seeking to dominate the world, and you said they're starting in space. Yeah, they are, because let's just start with the obvious one that many of your viewers probably already realize. Without GPS, most of the U.S. military just doesn't function anymore. I mean, we have really, really gambled on systems like that. We're about to gamble a lot harder because these constellations of satellites, such as Starlink, which SpaceX is launching, about, I don't know, 60 satellites at a time. It's going to be about 12,000 satellites, I think, when they go live, and more later. That's going to give you low latency broadband access from the middle of a jungle. It does not matter where you are on Earth. You're going to have incredible internet coverage. Now, everybody gets dependent on that, and what happens if it goes away? So suddenly you have a world interdependency that is so great and so space-based that you must have military assets sufficient to protect it. That's why we have to have Space Force, and that's why we have to have it now, not, you know, a decade from now or 50 years from now. So you're already in that direction, but that's just the beginning. That's the little stuff. What we're really looking at is a massive, massive gold rush, and it literally will involve gold, but it will involve every other thing under heaven. Rare earths, stuff as simple as iron. You're talking about things that are very nearby, near-Earth asteroids that just whiz past us all the time. They are not hard to get to as long as you solve the cost per pound to orbit problem from Earth to space. Once you're there, these things are not hard to reach. There are some non-trivial technical problems to do the mining and the processing, but the distance is not great, the energy expenditure is not great, and once you tap that, it fundamentally alters the economy of the entire planet. China gets it. If China dominates that first in a meaningful way, they will be a global empire. They will make global look like nothing. And that is a race that the United States simply must win. Elon, and for that matter, Jeff Bezos, are doing a tremendous job of getting us a leg up. And we may have that for a while, but we're going to have to take it very seriously.
No question, you've got to add energy to that, because if you put satellites up, you can access energy that you can beam from space.
Absolutely.
Here, that is clean, that's perfectly usable. You know, you put electricity coming directly from solar panels that are solar arrays put in space and then beamed to the Earth. I mean, it's incredible. If you own space, you can own everything on the planet.
And bear in mind, that same technology gives you kind of a super weapon. I mean, that's basically a space laser. So while we have that exact technology in theory going back to the 70s, it was cost prohibitive, but you could have done it. You're going to be able to do it. You're going to be able to do it inexpensively, but you better control it, because you could aim that same beam at New York City. And likewise, if you're mining on the moon or anywhere nearby, lob a pretty good sized rock into the middle of a city and it's basically a nuclear explosion. So make no mistake, our military assets are going to matter, and who dominates this in the near term is going to matter tremendously.
So Gordon, you have...
This whole thing about mining the moon is, I think, really critical, because that's what China is wanting to do. That is one of their main purposes. The other thing, of course, they've got the technology to bring down our satellites.
Yes.
The stalkers and the lasers and all the rest of it. And as Rob is mentioning, we've become extraordinarily dependent on our space-based assets, not just for military, but for commercial and everything else. So our whole way of life, in a sense, is at risk up there.
Well, we've entered a phase in this economic war where it's affecting individuals. Yeah. It is no longer an idea, well, they're hacking this corporation, so what, how does that impact me? Now it's impacting individuals. It's impacting our health with the coronavirus. Mm-hmm. But it's going beyond that, because it's impacting our finances. You may have lost your job. You may have seen the stock market move up and down. It's impacting our finances, but it's going to control our finances at some point. Every investment that we have going forward is going to have a China aspect to it. Every single one of them. And whether it's the good side, where we're investing in space, there's a lot of money to be made if you invest in space in the right way. There's a brilliant future ahead if our system continues to be the dominant system on the planet. But if we give in to the Chinese Communist Party system, there's no economic hope. They will punish anyone that they want to. And the idea that our investment future, that's why we have an economic war room, why you both are so important to our war room, is because we're pulling together ideas like these and we're putting them out to the American people. There are ways to invest. There are ways for you individually to invest so that you can profit and benefit from the future that we have and also avoid some of the pitfalls. And if you don't believe it, just look at the stock market over the past few months where you see Zoom and others that have done very well during a pandemic, but then there have been certain investments that have done very poorly during a pandemic. That's why we're training financial advisors with Liberty University. Economic War Room is going to train financial advisors so you can say, how does this impact my portfolio? What can I do to invest that helps the United States system and maybe not supporting the Chinese Communist Party? And there are very direct ways to invest. We talk about this with the thrift savings plan, where we were going to invest in Chinese companies with all of our patriotic servicemen and women's money and all the patriotic employees of the U.S. government and retirees. We're going to put money into companies that we were simultaneously sanctioning by our government for bad action and bad things that they were doing to our people and to their own people. But we can also make a difference. We can change and turn this around to we can invest. Rod mentioned being national, and he said, I'd prefer the term patriotic. We need to raise up patriotic investors who are going to guarantee that the liberties of the United States of America are shared with the rest of the world rather than taken away by the Chinese Communist Party. It is an existential fight, and it's why we're here at the Freedom Summit with the Falkirk Center. We're here with all of these great guests. We have a panel on the Committee on the Present Danger. We're going to be talking about the freedom that we can bring to people as they weaponize their money. We're in economic war, so you have to weaponize your money to fight the war. You're spending, you're giving, and you're investing. So let me turn back to you, gentlemen. What are some ways that you see that we can invest so as to protect American liberty as opposed to handing over the keys to the Chinese?
I think the most important thing is where we don't invest. We have, in China, they call us an enemy. Last year, People's Daily, the most authoritative publication in China, declared a quote-unquote people's war on the United States. So the question is, well, why are we allowing Americans to invest in an enemy to enrich them so that they can be better able to attack us? So to me, it's not a question of, I'm not a very good stock picker, but the most important thing is that as a nation, as a matter of national security, that we do not enrich a hostile Chinese regime.
We've propped them up, haven't we?
We certainly have. I mean, there's no question about that. What's the money that fuels that? That's from the United States. Or, for instance, MSCI, an index which everyone uses to make their investments. We allowed China to intimidate MSCI into including China into their portfolio of shares. And that meant people had to invest because it's an index.
Yeah.
So, yes, we've permitted this to happen. And we've had a series of successive administrations that have tried to, quote unquote, reform the Chinese financial system so that Americans can invest there. That's absolutely the wrong approach. What we should be doing is the president should be using his powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977 and saying, you can't do that anymore. And it's not just a question of investment, it's also trade, because we've enriched a hostile Chinese regime with trade.
So there are companies here that are American companies that are partners with China in so many different ways. Maybe you don't invest in them either. Maybe you send a message. So we have ESG, and Larry Fink and BlackRock are big proponents of making sure that your investments are environmentally sound, social justice and governance and all of that. And yet he'll turn around with the same breath and say, well, let's invest in China. We want to grow our investments in China. Tell me, what about China meets any of the ESG criteria? Are they good on the environmental issues?
Certainly not. Certainly not.
Or do they provide social justice? Are they are doing the right things to make sure that all peoples are raised and so forth? No. And is there corporate governance? When you invest in a Chinese company, you're investing in many cases in a variable interest entity that doesn't even have governance capabilities. You don't even get a shareholder vote.
China is imprisoning 1 to maybe 3 million people in concentration camps. It is implementing genocidal policies.
Yes.
It's institutionalized slavery of minority groups. These are crimes against humanity. And even if China weren't doing anything else that we've been talking about for the last hour, just alone, those things mean that we cannot have contact, investment, or economic nature with it. This is the 1930s with regard to the Third Reich. What China's doing today is in many ways comparable, in some ways worse, than what the Third Reich did prior to the mass exterminations.
Yes.
And so that alone means no investment.
No investment. Okay, and Rod, how do we invest in America's future? How do we take advantage of what we're seeing?
Well, it's not a matter of becoming insular. It's a matter of being wise. I mean, just like Gordon's saying, why are we propping up a self-declared enemy? This doesn't mean that we can't trade. This doesn't mean that we can't have an expansive approach. Quite the contrary. If it were me, I would suggest that as quickly as possible, Donald Trump conclude a deal to bring the United Kingdom into the USMCA. And actually, any nation that loves liberty and will actually act to defend it should increasingly be included in that. I think the free nations of the world can outcompete the unfree ones all day long and twice on Sunday, and we should do everything we can to encourage that. We don't need to be an autarky. We merely need to not be stupid, and we're really, really good at being stupid a lot of the time. So quit selling them the rope with which they will hang us, as it were. Moreover, it is important that we have a manufacturing base. I know that that is terribly out of vogue and sounds completely out of the 1950s, but the truth of the matter is we're seeing it right now. 80% of the PPE in the world is produced in China. How's that working out? Why are we allowing our prescription drugs to come from a self-declared enemy? Why are we so stupid, once again, about basic matters of security? And it makes sense if you happen to be the Chamber of Commerce, and it makes sense if you happen to be a libertarian, and you actually don't believe that there are governments that matter or that they have policies that are not strictly economically motivated. But the truth is the world is run by people who are not strictly economically motivated, and if we don't take account of that, we will see our own people crushed.
Well, all of these issues, and we talk about them in Economic War Room. We'll talk tomorrow in our panel. We'll talk with Rosemary Gibson, for example, on the pharmaceutical ingredients and so forth. But the key matter here is you can make a difference. The average American has a stake in this fight, and you can be economic warriors and you can be economic patriots. So we produce a battle plan with every episode of the Economic War Room. That battle plan recaps everything we've talked about, gives you the backup links so you can go on the web and do your own research and validate everything that we've said. So we'll produce that. You get that at economicwarroom.com. And we tell all of our viewers, you can be one of the small ships that makes a big difference. Yeah. Just from the Battle of Dunkirk, if it weren't for the small ships helping the British Expeditionary Force get off of Dunkirk and get back to England, that nation wouldn't have survived, and maybe we as a Western civilization wouldn't have survived. It's that important now. Be a small ship. You can learn more at economicwarroom.com, and you can get your financial advisor to help you weaponize your money to protect America and the freedom in this world. This is Kevin Freeman from the Economic War Room.